Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. My name is Adya, and I'm going to be in conversation with my colleagues Bharat and Anwesha today. They manage our tech policy course and do some of the most interesting work that we do on AI. And they recently attended the AI Summit, and I'd love to speak with them about some of their takeaways, what they think the AI ecosystem looks like for India. And yeah, let's dive right into it. Thank you so much for being here. Just to start off, one thing I'd been wondering about for a while is, everybody's talking about AI sovereignty, everyone's writing about it, it's become such a buzzword. But considering the fact that big tech companies already control most of the distribution modes, how do you think India can realistically build its own AI ecosystem without trying to reinvent the wheel? And what does that look like in terms of next steps for India?
So thanks for having us. And like you say, right, sovereignty was one of the most commonly used words during the summit. And so it's a very nebulous concept. So what does sovereignty mean? So is it self-reliance? Is it Atmanirbharta? Is it resilience, strategic autonomy? So there are very different interpretations of how you can think of sovereignty. And it's a I think a political term which has been transposed into a technological concept, and what that means in practice can be a little different when based on how you interpret it, right? And because of this different kinds of interpretations, so you have people talking about building indigenous models or indigenous data centers and so on. But what makes sense for us when we have been doing our research is to think of it as something that gives you strategic autonomy, the ability to take decisions based on India's national interest, and having a resilient supply chain. And when you think of it like this, I guess what it means is that you have competition, you have choice, and maybe in a lot of cases, even if you're not able to have an Indian model that is competing at the frontier. So you might have just a few, really large language models which are really powerful and capable of a lot of complex kind of reasoning and thinking tasks. And even if you have competition, you have a few different models from few different countries, some of which are open source. And that, I guess, gives you competition and choice in those options. And in a lot of other cases, you can have models that are, multilingual, multimodal, which we're able to build local applications on top of, address local use cases. So that's how you see sovereignty playing out in a lot of these conversations. So maybe we can dig into some of these in a little more detail, but that's broadly how we have seen the conversations around this.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to follow up, I was wondering for our listeners, where would we be in terms of reaching AI sovereignty in that sense? What are the things we need to focus on, especially in the next coming months and years?
So what you see in a lot of in the frontier of generative AI models is that there is some sort of market concentration. You have two or three big American companies which have the most powerful models, and you also have a bunch of Chinese companies which are building a lot of open source models, open weight models, which are amongst the best open weight models that are out there. Now, when you see the Indian models that are being developed, you see that there's a lot of focus on smaller models. You see that there's a lot of focus on multilingual use cases, multimodal applications like voice, text, maybe even video, and these kind of things, right? So when you look at these different approaches, I guess the amount of resources, the research abilities that are required to build something at the frontier is something that not a lot of countries are competing in. So you can have a different pathway towards sovereignty, and that for India would mean maybe being able to leverage the benefits of using generative artificial intelligence to deliver, say, public services, to make use cases available to a large section of society. And you hear a lot of use case, capital of the world, or India's focus being on applications, these kind of terms, right? So, and what that means, I guess, is that instead of focusing on the frontier of reasoning or thinking based generative AI models, we are focusing more on, at least the India mission's focus is that you address, these kind of AI models, which can, in areas like agriculture, healthcare, or education, where it can serve as a layer which makes it accessible for different people, irrespective of whether they're able to speak in English or understand written text. So making those kind of applications available to the population at scale is one of these things, and that's one way to think of sovereignty. So I'll maybe take one example which we saw during the expo at the summit, and this was, say, for an agricultural use case. You see, say, a farmer needs to get information about the weather conditions or, say, the soil quality, and decide what kind of a crop that they need to plant, and if there's some infection or some kind of a pest that is troubling that crop, then if they can take a picture and identify what kind of issue that there is, and identify what kind of remedies are required to fix that, those kind of interactions should be possible. And then if they go to sell this produce, right, so getting a fair price, identifying the quality of the produce, and then addressing information asymmetries in these kind of transactions. So in a lot of these steps, what you need is not a very large, complex kind of a model, but you need smaller kinds of, say, machine learning models, which are able to, say, identify an image, map it to a database, and say, identify what kind of a pest it is, or what kind of weather conditions are suitable for planting a certain kind of crop, or identify the quality of a grain based on an image. So these are all better addressed with smaller models, smaller maybe image identification models, and then you add an interface layer on top, which can again be a small language model, which just makes it easier to build a lot of these things and deploy it on a edge device, like say a mobile phone. Right? So these kind of applications which bring in smaller applications, address local use cases. So those are the kinds of things which are being considered at scale. And in a way, I guess that is also sovereignty. And for a lot of other use cases where you're talking about economic productivity and being able to use the most powerful models. So as long as you have competition over there, that still serves the purpose of being autonomous in the kind of decisions you make.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I honestly feel like I understand more about AI sovereignty now than I did 20 minutes ago. And I read a bunch of articles that mentioned it, but nobody really said what it was. So that was really fascinating. Thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the ideas that was in circulation at the summit. For example, you'd written about visit, don't move architecture for data residency. What do you think were some of the interesting ideas that were discussed? And do you think they're feasible for an Indian context?
So some of I mean, again, I'm focusing a little bit on ideas related to competition, and you see that amongst a lot of delegates from different countries, especially middle powers, there's a lot of concern about this concentration of market power amongst a few companies who will then who also have an advantage because they are able to distribute those models in because they own the means of distribution, say through an mobile operating system or through a browser platform that is commonly used already in a lot of these kind of cases, right? And so there's a lot of talk about how do you disaggregate these kind of different ecosystems so that someone building an AI system should be able to get their model or their application to users regardless of not being in control of these other distribution channels. So you hear of and in that context is where you see some of these kind of radical ideas coming out. So for example, one was this idea of visit don't move or data residency, that was proposed. So in one of the panels, the idea behind it was basically um, local data stays locally, and any model attempting to process or work on this data will have to work on this data in a clean room, or which is again going to be local, and the processing and the output will be generated locally, and it will be delivered to the user. And so the model is can be from anywhere, but the data and the output are local, right? So that was one of the kind of approaches that was proposed. I think this has been in the works in some of the DPI kind of implementations that are being considered. So that was one. So there are a bunch of other things where on a panel on competition, some of the panelists spoke about how you might need ex ante regulations because there are a lot of these kind of vertical integration of AI model providers with cloud service providers, and then the distribution channels also might be something that these kind of platforms own. So how do you disaggregate some of these things so that you can't compete in multiple of these areas and have competition in that sense? There were proposals to maybe how do you get different parts of the different countries who are interested in open source to work together. So there were proposals of maybe addressing some of these so it's a little fragmented in some sense that um, when there are different open source models, so how do you discover which is the best one? How do you then package that and deliver that? How do you ensure that the tooling and other ecosystems around it are all mature and robust. So these kind of conversations are there, and so there were a lot of proposals on how do you package it and make it available. How do you build a more mature ecosystem around it? So that's one. And in the same kind of thing, there was also some proposals for how maybe working with frontier model providers to make previous versions of their models open source so that even if the frontier model is if the most advanced model is proprietary, maybe one or two generations behind that could be made open source so that it enables access and open weight at least so that it enables access to a broader section of society. So I think these were some of the more interesting ideas around how competition could be encouraged.
Okay, thank you. Another area I was wondering about is that I know the government has been taking certain measures for India's AI ecosystem. I know that the budget offered this huge 21-year tax holiday for foreign firms using Indian data centers, and I think also there was subsidized GPU access for startups. I want to understand whether like who really wins here. Are we building the local ecosystem, and is this likely to benefit India in the long run, or do you feel like this is something that's subsidizing foreign hyperscalers, which doesn't really have any major benefits for us?
Right. So, sure. In the short term, I think the 21-year tax holiday for foreign firms, using Indian data centers, that will encourage significant investments. We also saw a bunch of announcements being made at the summit itself. And so, what this tax holiday and associated other safe harbor norms do is that it will provide some sort of guarantee for these bigger companies to then set up base in India, so to speak, and it lowers the financial barrier for hyperscalers. And obviously, given the high barrier to entry, it will perhaps disproportionately benefit established hyperscaler companies. And but what that will also do is potentially add about 6 to 8 gigawatts to India's currently about 1.7 gigawatt capacity in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And we're already seeing multiple gigawatt level projects being planned across definitely across Vishakhapatnam and other coastal areas, given the access to network, etc. But and similarly, there's obviously subsidized GPU access, which has been provided for the past about 1 year or so under the India AI mission, which provides affordable compute for startups, researchers, and students, which does again help these different stakeholders to develop different AI models, and it, as a result of the subsidies, it's also some sort of a guarantee that you will get access to at least this much GPU, given the geopolitical vulnerabilities that we may face, given that we are importing all of our GPUs. But then again, all of these are short-term measures, and now long-term success will demand more than just subsidies and tax breaks to then counter global oligopoly dominance, etc., in cloud and compute markets. And within India itself, if you're talking about data centers specifically, we face various structural hurdles if you're looking at the infrastructure that surrounds data centers. So, for instance, India's grid currently suffers 17 to 20% of transmission loss, which is quite high, and that, according to, I think, in 2023 or 2024, led to a loss of 0.5% of GDP. And similarly, our overall power ecosystem needs some sort of modernization. There are a lot of projects going on in the renewable space as well. But reliability of this electricity is key when we're talking about data centers. And so providing that much electricity to these gigawatt plants is what is going to be very important. So just looking at the tax holiday and the subsidy, I think for now is okay, and for now will bring in required innovation and just a bit of a push for startups and other researchers, students, etc., to innovate. But in the longer term, we need stronger infrastructural reforms. So one side of the story is power, and then the other side is also water. And generally, India is, in at least these two areas, resource scarce, so to speak. We do generate, I think, for now, enough power, although there is every year we increase power generation by, I think, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but we are increasing our generation capacity. And while we may be generating about enough, but due to transmission losses, that does translate to direct economic loss in not just data centers but across industries. So that is a very crucial area where we need reforms. We need a lot of the perhaps budget to go over there, and not just that, integrate renewables within the grid. And perhaps like one solution would be to have dedicated zones or areas for data centers, since data centers will not be built all across the country. They're very you need a certain form of climate, you need a certain availability of water, and it's better suited in areas where you have high renewable power generation capacity, so say in areas with solar energy or wind energy. So those are some of the things that need to be thought about. And even in the past, the current system with the tax holiday and the subsidy does resemble the PLI model from manufacturing previously. And we've seen how initially these incentives boosted exports, but then overall, it will hamper the overall market, and unless the infrastructure grows with the growth in data center capacity.
Okay, thank you for that. That was actually going to be the next question I was going to ask you, because I understand that, we have resource scarcities. I wanted to ask a little bit about edge AI. I get that it's very, very important, but I know that smart hardware is still at a place where it's fairly expensive. So how do we drive the cost of things down to a point where people in rural areas can actually be able to afford them and reap the benefits of these technologies that are designed for them?
So I think one benefit that we may have is that, again, like I mentioned, we are in these areas resource scarce, and so we've always found ways. We, as a country, we found ways to innovate frugally. And it's important that we encourage more of R&D in those areas. And I think that is being done overall in the ecosystem, like even Bharat mentioned with the agri-tech example, and there's similar things being done for education and healthcare. And I think overall, what we also saw at the summit was there was quite a lot of focus on developing AI for the masses in the Indian context. And actually, there is a top down approach to it, but there's also a bottom up approach to it. There are people at the grassroots who are engaging with communities and sort of understanding what their difficulties are in accessing technology. And coming up with really innovative, smart ways to diffuse this technology in ways in which it would help them. So maybe a generic, chatbot might not help, people, but then specific use cases that are linked to their livelihoods would. And there are people who are developing this. But again, one sort of concern that keeps coming up is the lack of network, and even within big cities we face occasional lack of connectivity, whether it's in terms of network or power. And so when we move outside of tier 1 and tier 2 cities, that obviously amplifies quite a bit. And I think with this sort of boost in the data center ecosystem that we can expect given the investments that are coming in, I think if we do this correctly, a second order effect would also be an improvement in the surrounding infrastructure, which may then lead to improved connectivity across these different areas, improved access to power. And I think overall, then, if we do this right, then that would enable the masses to have access to AI in a way that is also mindful of the resources that we have, and keeping in mind what use cases are helpful here, and not just we don't have resources to waste, so to speak. And so that, I think, is a benefit that we may have, and this seems to be the right time to take these things into account and have reforms in very specific targeted areas to then enable a more sort of sustained long-term growth in the ecosystem.
Thank you, Anwesha. Before we wrapped up, I had a final question that I'd love to hear both of you weigh in on. I mean, I understand that if India is serious about developing AI infrastructure, what do we need to do in addition to be able to support the ecosystem? What are the kinds of things that both of you think would be useful for India to focus on?
So yeah, I guess a lot of focus during the summit was on a lot of these big announcements, big tech companies and investing in infrastructure in India, big collaborations being announced, a lot of data center projects being announced. But there's also emphasis that needs to be there on creating AI for users who can, where there might not be a lot of purchasing power. So there's not a market that is present because of that, right? So the kind of applications that we talked about earlier, whether it's in agriculture or in healthcare or in education. So these are, when you look at a population scale kind of deployment, you need different kinds of business decisions which make it viable. So you might need government funding to enable some of these kind of use cases, or philanthropy to come in to make such use cases possible. So those are some things which where the governments could step in. So there's a lot of competition at the frontier of AI development, where big tech companies are trying to build better and more capable AI models and trying to address use cases like, say, coding or generative AI applications. So while all of those are great, and you need more competition, you need more uh, uh, um, innovation in that space. You also need frugal innovation applications which can benefit a large section of society, and that, I think, is where the government's efforts need to be. Um, so alongside that, I guess there is a lot of emphasis on the different opportunities that are available. There's a lot of optimism around it. And while this is something that's really exciting, you also need to be mindful about the kind of risks that come with it. Maybe it might be risks of exclusion, risks of a digital divide, risks of agency being lost, and cybersecurity risks, which are also escalating. So all of these, how do you build guardrails? How do you ensure that the awareness about these things is also um, keeping up with the pace of innovation? The guardrails that are needed to ensure that these are deployed responsibly are also keeping up with the pace of innovation. So that, I think, is something that's really important. And while there were a lot of discussions on the importance of these kind of things also being uh, progress needs to be done on these things. So you see that that is something that there's not too much of governance action around. So in a lot of different countries, governments are focusing on innovation, on a lighter touch regulation that can enable companies to innovate freely. And I guess safety and guardrails and a lot of these kind of things will catch up a little more slowly. And how do you create incentives to build it more responsibly is something that takes a lot of effort and collaboration between multiple stakeholders and governments. And that, I guess, is a weak link right now.
Just to add on a little bit, I think what Bharat highlights is a very interesting way of looking at AI innovation, and it being a very delicate balance between what we want in terms of innovating and then what we want in terms of safety and guardrails. And I mean, that being said, just having those conversations in a event as big as the Impact Summit was quite something. It does send across a message, and people are thinking about these things, but definitely a lot more needs to be done. And we've also sort of spoken a bit about how different countries are governing AI in different parts of the world in our recent report on the state of AI governance. But that being said, I'll maybe add a little bit on the compute side of things. So we spoke about large scale infrastructure and data centers and those things, but when we look at compute itself, it's been a contested area. There are just a few sort of countries which can sort of control the supply chain globally. And then looking multiple conversations around how low and middle income countries can sort of ensure reliable and continuous sort of access to compute. And one of the suggestions were having shared compute hubs, open compute hubs, and how you operationalize that is, while that's still a bit unclear. There are I mean, having multilateral partnerships to then pool in capital and technical resources at regional and multilateral levels is one thing, and then you implement open source principles to compute. And so doing these things can help countries secure reliable access to something that is, I mean, compute is not just used for training, so now increasingly will be used for inference use cases as well, which applies equally to all countries that are using AI, right? So I think that's another consideration that needs to be made in the very near future as we go into a more inference heavy sort of landscape when we're looking at least at large language models. But yeah, I think overall, just having that wide variety of conversations at the summit itself and also around it, before it, and there were a bunch of events surrounding the summit. I think that's quite important for a country to sort of have these discussions on a larger scale and at least have some sort of a pathway forward when we're looking at AI development. So yeah, a bunch of things to be done, but these are some of the areas that could be focused on.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you both. That was really interesting. And to our listeners, I really, really suggest you check out the State of AI Governance report. I think it would really help you understand the landscape better. Thank you both.
Thank you, Adya.
Thanks, Adya.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.